All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our, I can't even keep track anymore, fourth or fifth event during the Global 16 Days campaign being organized by Equality Bahamas. We look forward to this campaign every year. It's a time to be able to engage with people, experts, practitioners, people with various experiences in the Bahamas, throughout the Caribbean region, and around the world on this important topic of gender-based violence and what we need to do to address it and to equip activists, particularly people who are new to the space, who want to deepen their practice with tools to really increase the impact of the work that we're doing. This year is a tough one. We decided on this theme of rage and anti-resilience, just feeling that we needed a space to talk about the importance of rage and being able to access this emotion, especially as women, as girls, LGBTQI plus people who are experiencing various forms of oppression, and human rights defenders, people who are in this space that is actually quite difficult, doing a lot of work and often feeling like we're not making the kind of progress that we want to make. So there's a lot of rage and we have to make space for it and figure out how we can encourage others to tap into this and not allow it to just dissipate. How do we channel it into something? And then on the resilience side, really changing the framing of resilience so that we're not thinking about people, women mostly, having to be strong and bouncing back from any and everything that we have to face in this life and just smiling through struggle. What does it look like to build resilient systems? And what does it look like to build the kinds of communities where there is care, where there's a care model and where there is a concern for each other and recognition of our interdependence, our reliance on relationships for our survival. And I mentioned this is a difficult year because just days before the start of this campaign on November 25th, we saw the reports of rape and femicide of two people, Adrielle Moxie, who was 12 years old, and Renensha Butler, who was 72 years old, just days apart, Wednesday and Saturday. Seeing these reports and just the brutality of these crimes, that they continue, that gender-based violence persists. And we are faced consistently with the fact that femicide is the outcome in many cases of gender-based violence when there is no intervention. And the work that we have ahead of us is not figuring out punishment. It's figuring out how we stop this from happening and addressing not just interpersonal violence, but structural violence in the ways that the systems that exist, including laws and policies and practices, create an environment where violence is not only possible, but predictable. And we're bringing that to all of our conversations during this campaign. And if you want to learn more about other events that are coming up and our demands for this year, every year we have demands. This year we have 4. You can check out the full event lineup at tiny.cc/16days24. It's tiny.cc/16days24. And throughout this session, we will be talking about, we're going to get a little technical. We're going to talk about a tool, a very important tool. We're talking about the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also known as CEDAW, also known as the Bill of Women's Rights. We're going to talk about this convention that the Bahamas ratified in 1993 and what needs to happen to come into compliance with it, but also how we use it. How can we use it as activists, as advocates, as residents, and how the government needs to use it and take particular actions so that what is in that convention can become a reality and help us to build the systems that we need so that we are not looking at women and girls and saying, you need to be strong, you need to be able to bounce back, you need to be able to be resilient no matter what. So we're going to get into this conversation. I am Alicia Wallace. I'm a part of the team here at Equality Bahamas, and I am very excited to be in conversation with Marion Bethel, who is a longtime friend and advisor and mentor of all of us here at Equality Bahamas, and has spent a long time, a couple of terms, as a member of the CEDAW Committee, traveling to Geneva multiple times a year to meet with colleagues, to review state reports from all over the world and make recommendations on how states can come into compliance and end discrimination against women. And today we are going to talk about the convention, about what it is, and some of the recommendations that have been made to the Bahamas, and what we need to be looking at right now in this political moment, within this social crises that we are experiencing in the aftermath of these rapes and femicides, and during the 16 days campaign, when we are supposed to be focusing on our activism and how we can make it stronger and better and move things faster and in more meaningful ways. So I'm inviting you, Marion Bethel, to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you and what you do and where you are with I guess you can make some announcements about where you are with the CEDAW committee as well. You're muted still.
Okay, it helps to unmute, right? So thank you, and good to see all of you online on Zoom, and those of us that are listening on Facebook. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you to Equality Bahamas for having me. I am a long-term friend of Equality Bahamas and really admire profoundly the work that Equality Bahamas has done and continues to do to really, till the ground in the Bahamas in particular, but throughout the Caribbean and other places where Alicia and her team do our work. And so I'm really grateful for the kind of work that is being done in the Bahamas in particular to really bring awareness to women's human rights, gender-based violence in particular, and how we as citizens and women, feminists and NGOs can really move our work forward so that we can be the agents of change and transformation in this Bahamas and also the Caribbean region throughout the world. So I currently sit on the CEDAW committee, and I've got one more month in my official position as vice chair and rapporteur. I demit office December 31st, 2024. And it's a bittersweet time for me because it's been 8 years that I've been on the committee, monitoring compliance of all states parties around the world, ensuring that they comply with the articles of the convention. So I've got one more month to go, and my time is coming to an end, but it's been a wonderful 8 years of an 8-year journey of learning for me and also hopefully contributing to the human rights of women and girls worldwide. So I will be here in the Bahamas on the ground, January 2025, working with Equality Bahamas and other institutions here to advance human rights generally and women's human rights in particular. So that's where I am right now. And I think we'll just move on with looking at the CEDAW Convention. I think one of the things that I want to say is that the UN CEDAW Convention, it's a UN human rights convention that came out in 1979, and it was became public in 1981, actually, or being able to be enforced. The Bahamas, as Alicia said, signed on to it in 1993. So in common language, it's really the Bill of Rights for Women. It's a very comprehensive Bill of Rights for women under the jurisdiction of the United Nations. And a convention or a treaty is really very simply put, a contract, an agreement between states parties to comply with and honor the convention and what it is asking, or what it demands that states parties do who have ratified that have ratified it. So it's a comprehensive Bill of Rights for women, and it lays out very clearly the rights of women and where the obligations are. The states parties have the obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of women. We as women and girls, we are the rights holders under the convention, and we have the agency to demand that the states parties fulfill their obligations under the convention. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So it's a legal and conceptual framework for women's human rights, women's and girls. And what it recognizes is that in spite of a legal framework that may be in place domestically, women's rights are still trampled upon and not respected and not promoted and not fulfilled. And so the mechanism that is the convention really legitimizes women's rights, and it is a tool, a mechanism that NGOs and feminist women's groups like Equality Bahamas can use domestically and regionally and worldwide to demand our rights under the convention. So it is a useful tool. And further to that, the CEDAW challenges systems and ideologies and structures, social structures that perpetuate discrimination against women. So the linchpin or the lever of the convention is really the issue of discrimination against women and girls. And there are two principles. One is the principle of gender equality between women and men, and the other principle is non-discrimination on the basis of sex and gender. This is built into these two principles are built into the convention and are the cornerstone of the convention. And so states parties really need to pay attention to the legal definition of discrimination, which the convention offers, and women, girls, can use that legal definition to advance access to justice for any breaches of the discrimination under the convention. So I want to, again, just circle back to this issue of CEDAW really focusing on systems, ideologies, and structures, institutions that perpetuate discrimination against women and girls. And we can look at that a little bit more. And so in response to what Alicia has been saying is that we want the kinds of structures that are resilient and not call on women and girls to be the resilient persons, but that structures and institutions can be resilient. And so I'm really, in preparation for coming here, I looked at the convention, Alicia, and I looked at the preamble in particular. And the preamble is really filled with aspirational kinds of aspirations, an environmental aspiration of social justice, for one, of changing the international economic order. And all of this is with a view to realizing gender equality and the human rights of women. It also speaks very clearly to issues around militarization and arms, etc. And so I think if we look at the preamble itself, it really gives us a great framework within which to do our work around resilience, because the convention itself, like, let's say, the Constitution of the Bahamas, it's a living document. It's a robust, dynamic convention, treaty, any treaty that is open to interpretation and evolution and development. And so I think when you speak, Alicia, and Equality Bahamas of resilience in terms of institutions and structures and social structures, I think CEDAW really does offer that possibility to us, and we just need to make use of it. And so I think that is probably where I want to stop in terms of just what is CEDAW and what its mission is and what it's trying to do. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And we've put the link to the convention in the chat so that anyone who's not familiar with it or you need a refresher, you can read through it. And the language is pretty clear. It's not too technical. You should be able to read it and to have a general understanding of what the convention is saying.
Sorry.
When we look at
There's just one more thing I wanted to say. I'm sorry, and then you can. I just wanted to say too that the convention explicitly, indicates that the discrimination against women and girls is socially constructed. It's not a natural order of business as we may think, and that it is socially constructed, and that it's embedded in the social structures and institutions of which we are all a part, including the family, the church, schools, employment, places of employment. And so the work that we do looks at social structures and demands that they are changed and transformed, and that we, women and girls and NGOs like Equality Bahamas, are really the agents of change in this dynamic. Sorry about that. Thanks, Alicia.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point, and it's something that I found really interesting when I first started learning about the convention, and in particular participating in the review of the Bahamas in 2018, taking note of what the experts on the committee were saying, some of the questions they asked, some of the points that they made, but in particular when we saw the concluding observations or the recommendations that were made by the CEDAW committee following the review, it was quite interesting to me that there were so many points that focused on the responsibility of the state, of the government, to change these social structures and the way that we think about gender, the way that we think about women and girls and men and boys. And that comes across in the convention for me most clearly in Article 5, I think, which is focused on gender stereotyping. Why do you think this is so integral to the full convention, this focus on gender stereotyping, and how is it connected to this broader issue of gender-based violence?
Right. So yes, Article 5 is the article on gender stereotyping, and states parties are obligated under Article 5 of the convention to challenge and eradicate harmful stereotypes and gender stereotypes that continue to see women as inferior to men and men as superior to women. And this is played out in many ways. And so if you look, I think the one that's most up in our face and is the issue around women in decision making and parliament, let's say, where we have the perpetuation of male leadership as being the desirable way to go in terms of governance. And so we can see that gender stereotypes play a real role in how society thinks about women as leaders, women as transformative agents, and women being able to perform in areas of governance. Yes, there are women in our parliament, but but they're there really at the sufferance of men in so many ways, and they many of them have really challenged this whole male bastion of governance, but it still persists. And so that is one of the areas where we see gender stereotypes play out quite a lot. Now, what happens under Article 5 is that states parties are required to transform gender roles within the family and in public spaces. So the private public divide is challenged by the convention and by the CEDAW committee to transform it. So the gender stereotypes of women as nurturers, as solely as caretakers, and unremunerated, often unpaid persons within the family, within the public sphere, often too. These stereotypes are ones, again, that place women at a disadvantage in the social and political and economic structures of our society. So gender stereotypes, where we ask that, where we demand that the traditional roles of parenting be shared. And that is one way. I mean, this can also be beneficial, should also be beneficial to men and fathers in our society. So the way it translates then into gender-based violence and the connection there is that women, by and large, in most societies around the world, because gender-based violence is prevalent everywhere, in every country that has come before us. We're talking about Nordic countries, European countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries. Gender-based violence is pernicious, it's vicious, and it almost feels like it's never ending, and it's not going to go away. But we know that that is not so, because we know that all of this is socially constructed and can be changed. And so the ideas that women are, one, the property of men still persist, that women are there to benefit men, and that men's entitlement, patriarchy, the hegemony of men and the dominance of men is what the order of the day is for most countries. And yes, there are changes and modifications to that, but that is the underlying burden that is still there, that translates then into women and girls being targets of the objects of male entitlement, male violence, toxic masculinity. And this results, as we see every day, in sexual assault, rape, and femicide. So the whole idea of women still being not valued, undervalued, and really at best, an appendage to men and their helpmate, as is often put forward in biblical doctrine, really undermines and violates the agency of women to live a life and the right to be free of gender-based, to be free, and the right to realize the right to be free from gender-based violence, because of the patriarchal dominance and views of women and girls as objects of sexual assault and rape and male pleasure and male violence in particular.
In the concluding observations, I found that the committee made this connection that you're talking about very clear. It's quite explicit, where the committee expresses, it says committee remains deeply concerned about a couple of things, and those are the persistence of deep-rooted patriarchal attitudes and discriminatory stereotypes concerning the roles and responsibilities of women and men in the family and in society, and the fact that stereotypes are also root causes of violence against women, and that there haven't been significant efforts toward addressing this. And then the committee goes on to make specific recommendations to address this, including a gender policy implementation plan, awareness raising around gender stereotypes, enhancing education at the primary and secondary level to look at gender stereotypes and prejudices and family relationships. And this makes it very clear to me that the committee knows and expects, and the government knows that it must, if it's serious about addressing gender-based violence, have some effect on the way that the general public views women and girls, and the way that we create these very narrow ways of life for people, for one another, based on gender. And I think it might be difficult for people to conceptualize what action by the government should look like. Do you have ideas about what the government should be doing to have a real effect to end gender stereotyping?
Right, to end gender stereotyping. I think it's such a huge area that permeates every aspect of our life. But I can certainly see that what we do on the committee is we ask governments or demand that governments look at school curriculum for one, which is where young people are firstly, well, secondarily or maybe thirdly, because there's the family, then there's the church, where young people are exposed to gender stereotyping within schools, and within the curriculum of the schools, and perhaps with how students are taught. I know there are some instances where I understand that the male students, for example, are called on more than female students to respond to questions. So one of the it's such a huge question, and it really takes an entire look at the society. Alicia, is what I'm trying to say, and I'm focusing now on schools and the role that they can play, and government obviously is the state actor that manages the schools. So one way is to just really look at our curriculum, look at how we socialize students within the school system, how we channel girls in one way and boys in another way. These are it's going to take a comprehensive overview of all of our institutions, not just the schools, so that all of the institutions are complementary to each other in terms of eradicating gender stereotypes. Because you would have to look at Parliament, for example. You would have to look at our religious institutions. All of these institutions require the kind of attention that is needed to begin to eradicate gender stereotyping. But yes, I think the schools is a good place to start, which is where we ask states parties in the CEDAW committee to look at schools. We also focus on the family structure very much in terms of gender stereotyping, and there are ways in which we address that in terms of caretaking and nurturing of children, so that women are not the only, so that women are a part of the caretaking and nurturing, along with other individuals and adults, fathers within the home. So issues around parental leave for fathers to take off of work and come home and be with their children. So there are many ways in which the government can respond to issues of gender stereotyping. You can look at the public media, TV, radio. I mean, that's often where you find gender stereotypes also being put forward. So if I look at our national TV, ZNS, again, it's a government-controlled institution that could also respond to eradicating gender stereotypes by putting forward positive ways in which women and men can be seen, and boys and girls can be seen. So I don't think that is any one way. I think it's just massive, and we do have to begin somewhere. And an NGO like Equality Bahamas, for example, does work around promoting positive views of what men and women and boys and girls do and can do. But you're asking specifically about the state party and what its obligations are under the convention. So, for example, Rwanda came before us in I think it was in June of this year, and there was a whole question around women in Rwanda not wanting to speak up about domestic violence, because they felt that it's just not culturally acceptable to talk about domestic violence, and that they must, the stereotype then is for them to just grin and bear the domestic violence. And so we called on the state party to open up the conversation publicly, nationally, around domestic violence within Rwanda. so that it becomes a public conversation and not a private family matter. So there are many ways in which the government can advance and put forward strategies, policies in particular, and legislation that can address gender stereotypes, particularly in regard to gender-based violence.
I really appreciate the point about family life and the way that laws and policies impact the way that we shape our families and the way that we behave. And you mentioned parental leave, which has become an issue that Equality Bahamas has been looking at over the last year and a half, because we've been thinking so much about gender stereotyping, thinking so much about unpaid domestic and care work that is almost completely taken on exclusively by women and girls. And in thinking about how we begin to address that, we started kind of digging and trying to figure out where is the root. And when you really think about it and you go back to the Employment Act, you see that women get maternity leave and men get no leave. So already we're setting up this environment where there's the expectation that women are going to take on the child rearing on their own, and there's no time set aside for men to participate in that work. And so we have decided to delve into that, and we've been conducting research, and we'll have a report pretty soon on our findings from focus groups and interviews and things like that, to look at what leave can look like. And sometimes we really get stuck thinking about what exists, forgetting that we can create something else, we can create something new. So I really appreciate that point and that connection between the law and society and the ways that we kind of take our lead from.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really, I'd like to speak a little bit more about the law, Lisa, because it's really I really rankle at this, because I honestly believe that because the pinnacle of our legal architecture, that is the Constitution, entrenches discrimination against women, entrenches it, all right, allows it to happen. I think for me, that is really a major, for me, it's a starting point. That has to change, because for me, there's a cascade of discriminations that then flow from this very top place, our Constitution. And so the laws, like the one you just pointed out, the employment law, the abortion law, I mean, yeah, all of these are discriminatory against women, and they're allowed to be discriminatory against women because they originate from our Constitution, which allows it. And so I am really clear in my own mind that the Constitution, as the pinnacle of our legal architecture, has got to be dismantled, transformed, and restructured around this issue of gender discrimination. And for me, that's what has to happen fundamentally. And I think things, because it sets the norm, it sets the standard for society and how we think about women, that we are really second-class citizens under our own Constitution. And whether we want to articulate that or not, it is a fact. So it is not surprising to me that our other laws follow suit. The criminalization of marital rape, the lack of political will to criminalize marital rape, for God's sake. I mean, where are we? And again, for me, we can change our national laws, our domestic legislation. We also have to transform the Constitution. And there are many other areas of the Constitution that need attention to. It's not just this issue of discrimination against women, but we're talking about that right now. And so that is really a focal point for me. And in that it sets the standard, and the normalization of women being inferior to men, which is what Article 5 is about. Article 5 speaks to that issue of stereotypes where you have which put forward the superiority of men and the inferiority of women. It's right there in the language of Article 5, and yet our laws entrench it.
There's so much that we can say about the Constitution and the need for constitutional reform, and it came up in 2018. That was just 2 years after the 2016 referendum, and the attitude of the government at that time seemed to be, well, we tried, didn't work. And the concluding observations from the CEDAW committee still said, you need to do this again. And in the interim, take every step possible to make changes to legislation, because it doesn't require the same steps and processes as changing the Constitution does. And for a time, we were hearing that, maybe the government would like to address this issue of citizenship at least. Attempt that at another time. We heard different administrations say that, but I think it's important to point out that in the UPR process, the fourth cycle, which was last year, there were recommendations on issues of sex and gender-based discrimination and gender unequal nationality laws, specific to the Constitution. And the response that the government gave to those recommendations was that there are no plans for constitutional reform at this time. And I don't think that had really been said at the national level so clearly as it was said to the UN, which is quite interesting and instructive for us, so we know where we are and the work that we need to do, right?
Right. Because, just to belabor this a little bit more, I mean, the Constitution itself underscores a stereotype, where you have the issue that a woman should follow her husband if he's a foreigner, and if a Bahamian woman is married to a non-Bahamian, really the idea is that she needs to leave, not necessarily have citizenship granted to him. Whereas a Bahamian man who's married to a non-Bahamian woman, yes, there's no issue with her being here, but it gives the male, the male Bahamian, the advantage, and the stereotype is then that yes, Bahamian women need to follow their husbands abroad if they marry a non-Bahamian, and yes, their children also should be given the citizenship of the non-Bahamian man, and so those are in my mind stereotypes right there in terms of male leadership and dominance, and the entitlements that go with that are not accorded to Bahamian women.
Most definitely. And I want to open for folks to ask questions, make comments, share ideas in the chat. If you're on Zoom, in the comments, if you're on Facebook. If you're on Zoom, you can also use the raise your hand function if you'd like to unmute so that we can hear your voice. That would be great, but you will appear in the recording, just so you know. And while people are thinking about what they might like to share or contribute to the conversation, because you brought up everything that you just did about the Constitution and about stereotypes being embedded in it, it made me think about Article 2, which is on policy measures, and that the Bahamas has reserved on Article 2. Now, folks who are with us or people who end up watching this recording might not know what that means. Can you say a little bit about what Article 2A in particular is about and what it means that the Bahamas has a reservation on it?
Right. So yes, so when the Bahamas ratified the CEDAW Convention in 1993, it it made a reservation on several articles. Article 2 Article 9, which is about nationality rights, and another article, Article 26, which I want to talk about a little later. But Article 2 of the convention is the key of the convention. It is the article that sets out the states parties' obligations under the convention. And this is why you ratify a convention. You ratify it because you know you are entering into an agreement where you, as the state party, have a duty and obligation to do what the convention is saying. And the convention is clearly saying to advance the human rights of women. So Article 2 sets out the state that, and says very clearly that the state party must embody the principle of equality of women and men in its constitution, in its legislation. It's very clear in black and white that the state party must do this. Well, as we know, we've been saying for the past 10 minutes, the Bahamas' constitution does not embody the principle of equality and non-discrimination. In fact, it does just the opposite. It allows discrimination against women under its constitution. So Article 2 is the article that under which the state party must perform in a particular way to embody and embrace and enact legislation around the principle of equality and non-discrimination. The Bahamas reserved on that, knowing full well that its constitution does just the opposite, embraces just the opposite. So really and truly, when you sign a convention and treaty, you ought not to reserve on the fundamental principles of the convention. Article 2 is a fundamental principle of the convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women by embracing in your domestic legislation, your constitution, your public policies, your programs, the idea, the principle of equality and non-discrimination. So the Bahamas is really in violation of Article 2 all around. And the reservation that it has placed on Article 2 really hampers, in my mind, the advancement of human rights for women here. Hampers it from a certain perspective, meaning that we as the rights holders under the convention, we still have work to do. We still, the work goes on until the Bahamas lifts this reservation, and this reservation, I think, will only be lifted, I shouldn't say only, could be lifted, would be lifted if we can change the constitution for one. But the Bahamas has reserved, and every time the Bahamas comes before the CEDAW committee, and it's been before the committee twice now, the committee says you must lift the reservation because you are running afoul of the convention, its mission, its spirit, its everything. The Bahamas understands that very well. It also knows that the Constitution runs counter to Article 2 of the convention, and therefore it tells the committee that they've tried twice now with 2 referenda, and the people have spoken, and the people have rejected the 2 principles of equality and non-discrimination. My view is that the government has to do more. There has to be a political will. There has to be leadership that really understands its international and domestic obligations and brings the kind of awareness to our citizens of why we need to change the Constitution, why it's important under this convention and other conventions too, not just the CEDAW Convention, that the Constitution in regard to those 2 principles of equality and discrimination must be changed. I don't think in either referendum, the government made that kind of positioned itself in that kind of way and helps the citizens to really understand what its obligations are internationally and domestically under this convention. So we as the rights holders, we still have our work cut out for us in terms of constitutional reform. And I think, Alicia, you're also saying that there are ways that we can keep the constitutional reform in mind because it has to be kept in mind. But there are other things too that in tandem, we can still work on other things within our community and our country to bring awareness to the issues that are of concern to us. So I'm not for 1 minute saying that we must not do anything until we change the Constitution. That's not what I'm saying at all. Yes.
One example of that is that we absolutely need to amend the Constitution to deal with the issue of gender unequal nationality rights. We need to look at Article 8, Article 10, 14, and until we get to that place where we have another referendum to make these changes to the Constitution, we should be looking to the Bahamas Nationality Act to make amendments there so that we have something in the interim.
Yes. Yeah.
But that would not be the final goal.
Right. And I have such mixed feelings about that, Alicia. I really understand that there are many women, Bahamian women, whose children do not have citizenship and entitlements to citizenship because of the constitutional restriction. And so going under the Bahamas Nationality Act is a way to have your children, be given passports and become citizens of the Bahamas. And I think that is an intermediary step, as you're saying. But let me be very clear that my constitutional right as a Bahamian is different from going by way of the BNA to get citizenship. That's a different animal altogether. That's an application process, and it's not a constitutional right. And those of us who are Bahamians under the Constitution have a superior right to citizenship. So it has its pluses, and I'm still thinking that they ought to be given that right under the Constitution. That really is the principal right, so to speak.
Definitely, yeah. The legislation isn't good enough, and as you said, it comes with a complicated process and a wait, whereas handling it through the Constitution, it would be automatic, and people wouldn't have to go through all of this nonsense. And we all know what bureaucracy looks like around here. To the same point, the CEDAW Committee also recommended that the state look at all laws, have a comprehensive review of all legislation to identify discrimination and to make repair, right?
Reparation, correct.
So important to note that is supposed to be happening. And we know that UN Women was engaged to do this, and there was a draft report that has yet to be finalized. And it's been years, and we still don't have the final report. So we continue to chase it down and have every expectation that it should be coming.
And so one of the discriminatory laws, well, there's several, but one of them is this issue of the marital immunity and the exemption under the Sexual Offences Act that, we've been demanding the criminalization of marital rape. And the way the law is framed now, it's discriminatory against women. So, yeah, so something like that, for example, we have put a lot of energy into it, and we continue to make that demand, and it doesn't affect directly the issue of the Constitution. On the Constitution, for me, it only affects that in the sense of what I've said before, is that it's a cascade of discriminations that originate in the Constitution that find their way through other legislation. But you can change this Sexual Offences Act without reverting to the Constitution. So let's make it happen. Yeah,
it's very frustrating, and it's clearly a long road that we're traveling. I feel like we've already been on it a really long time.
Yeah.
We do have some questions coming in. One is what can we do as citizens of the Bahamas and or in our professional capacity to better advocate for constitutional reform, full ratification of CEDAW, I think they mean the removal of the reservations, or amendments to the Nationality Act. Obviously support the organizations doing this work, but what other recommendations do you have for what individuals can do?
Yeah. So I think it's really important that we as individuals combine our forces and work together. We are stronger together than we are as individuals. Okay, obviously individuals can also do this kind of work, but I do believe that feminist groups like Equality Bahamas really is the way to go to galvanize our strength, our energies, our ideas, our vision for how we see this country. Because when we ask about constitutional reform, we're talking about what kind of country and region do we want to live in. So it's a big question that is not just about changing a constitution. It's a full question, and so I think that a movement, a women's movement, a feminist women's movement is really key to making the kinds of changes that we want. And I can well say that I think Equality Bahamas is I use the word tilling the ground, and I mean that in a very profound way. I mean, really making the ground, helping us to understand where we are in this time and place in terms of domestically, regionally, and the global political situation. And so I think it requires a movement. I think it requires a structured organization, no movement to make the kinds of changes that we want. So all individuals, in my view, we need to come together and move with one accord for the changes that we see. I'm not sure I can see it any other way. So I'd like some feedback on that, though, if somebody can, point to another direction that we can move in to make the kinds of demands that we want.
I think that is an area that we have a lot of work to do in terms of building a movement, building a constituency that really has power, not just people, but people who are equipped and who are energized to do this work for the advancement of women's rights and building a peaceful and equitable future. And that has to be for all women, not just some of us, right? It has to be for all of us. And it's difficult to do. And we know it's possible because it has existed. We have seen what the movement looked like in the 80s and the 90s, and something happened between then and now, which I'm sure lots of people have different takes on what happened and what didn't happen. But I'm hoping that we have some conversations in 2025 with people who were a part of the movement in the region then about what it looked like and how you were all able to build and to move together, and what it was like to have that energy and to be in Beijing and to to be at these huge conferences advocating and engaging with governments and kind of infiltrating, right? Some of the governments and departments. There's a lot to talk about there.
Right.
I see we have a hand, but we also have some comments. So I'm just acknowledging that I see your hand. We have some comments that came before. And did you want to say something else there just now?
I was just thinking of other parts of the movements which involve our own personal costs that are a part of any movement that would also need to be talked about, how much can we give as individuals, and how much,
Mm.
what areas, and what do we want to give, and what are the risks that are involved in this kind of organizing and mobilizing and movement building. Yeah, it has some costs and risks and rewards too. So
Very fun questions that you're,
yeah, yeah.
but very important to think about before you get in, I think, before you really dive deep. It's great to have that assessment. We
Was
have, oh,
question in here?
pardon me?
Your question that you were saying? Sorry.
Yes.
Mhm.
There appears to be a global pushback or backlash on gender equality and women's rights. Has this been evident in the work of the CEDAW Committee?
Oh, absolutely. 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 Oh, my goodness. Oh, sorry. Am I still here?
Yes, we still see you and hear you.
Yes. Yes. So this is very evident in the CEDAW committee. Yes. I'm just trying to think of a particular response in terms of yes. So there's been a real assault on the use of the word gender for one. I think that's one of the things that is very upfront. There's people want to be removed from that. They want it removed from the language that we use. There's a whole movement against transgender women in particular, as part of the conversation of the CEDAW committee. Yes, there's issues around access to reproductive health services, particularly safe abortion. That's part of the rollback on women's rights worldwide. Yes, so the political agenda that is really anti-women and anti-human rights is very much a part of the work that we do. We're more than aware of it, and we challenge governments on it. Actually, we challenge them to create the kind of civic space for women human rights defenders, for women to do the work that we do in advancing women's human rights without reprisals that are often in place when women do the work that we do. So yes, the global pushback on women's human rights is very much a part of the work that we do. I mean, we've been looking very carefully at Afghanistan, for example, which is really an extreme issue in regard to the rollback of women's rights and the ascendancy of the Taliban and its authoritarianism and the segregation of women in their homes. They can't even, barely come out, and they can't sing in public and do it. I mean, it's just a caricature at this point of life. I mean, it's mind-boggling. That's one extreme of how the pushback on women's human rights is so evident globally. Okay. And I don't want us to lose sight of our own domestic situation too, where there are pushbacks on the use of the word gender. There's a further marginalization of the LGBTQI plus persons, and yeah, it's very much there. And so one of the questions I'd like to ask is how do we respond to that domestically? Because I think the whole issue around the criminalization of marital rape is a part of this whole sort of movement of shutting down women's rights and catering to and placating and pleasing men.
Yeah, there's actually a follow-up to that question. which is to what extent, if at all, has the apparent pushback globally on gender equality entrenched anti-rights positions, anti-women's rights positions here in the Bahamas?
So let's have a conversation about that. I mean, other persons can respond to that, but I think again, the the resistance to criminalizing marital rape, I think, is one of those, falls into that category for me. I think the chill and the silence that we have around talking about the right to safe abortion in the Bahamas is also part of this conversation.
Yeah, and we definitely see the rhetoric from the US, that same kind of language being adopted and used here. And a lot of these ideas coming to us through media, mainstream media, social media, but also through
Mhm. Mhm.
religious fundamentalists
Right. Right.
who really have a captive audience
Mhm.
that is ready to accept this rhetoric and parrot it, usually without a whole lot of critical analysis of what's being said and what it means for people and what it means here and why that messaging is being brought
Mhm.
to us. So I think there's a lot for us to unpack with regard to the global anti-rights
Right.
sentiment and how it is taking root and being spread probably to more vast degrees than we're able to share our human rights messaging.
Mhm.
And what does that mean? And how do we need to shift?
Right.
Khadijah, do you want to unmute?
Yeah. Good night, everyone. Marion, thank you for being here so much. We- Sorry, y'all, I was eating, but we look forward so much every time, you grace our presence. And so I have a lot of questions, but I'm curious if you've seen any examples in like whether it's like recent or like modern history where um like countries have been able to uh like basically like where a movement has been able to like build social trust, where people that kind of want the same things, right? Like, so different women's organizations in this context, like want the same things, but maybe disagree on other issues, like where they've been able to overcome some of that like discord. Because I feel like sometimes there's two things that need to be happening at the same time, right? Like there's the education around gender and why inequality as a whole is bad, but why like this specifically is bad, and also education around like movement building and like the understanding that we don't have to agree on everything to get things done. Because I kind of feel like, yeah, that's something that really holds us back. So I'm just wondering if you've seen any examples.
Well, Milo, this is amazing. And Alicia, you have to forgive me for this because, you know, you've asked a question that is so close to my heart, because what I know and what I feel about our own women's suffrage movement, and Alicia, you know this is where I'm heading, is profound. I think we do not know enough about it. I think we don't care enough about it. I think we still see it as a footnote to history. But Khadijah, you have asked the question that is really exercised me mentally, intellectually, emotionally, in so many different ways. And I think, let me just be very blunt. We have our own movement here that was built post World War II in the 50s and 60s that got us the right to vote. The methodology and the journey to movement building, it's documented, right? I have some of the documents. I've done the documentary on it, But these were women who did not have, who were not nearly half as educated formally as we are today, who knew about the United Nations and the instruments of that day, of the post-World War II, the 50s and 60s. They used those same UN instruments to get us the right to vote. But we do not know this history well enough to say, to build on it and to have confidence in it, and to understand what you talked about, Khadijah, as the social trust that was built into that particular movement that fueled it and pushed it forward to its realization of the right to vote, but not just the right to vote, because the right to vote for them was just a portal to racial equality, democracy, majority rule, a bigger vision of the society. And so that's what I was trying to say when I, talked about what kind of world do we want to live, what kind of country do we want to live in. So it's not just one thing, as you've said, it's a whole vision of life that we want for our people, which is what the women's suffrage movement envisioned. And so I could go on for 3 hours talking about the women of the women's suffrage movement in this country, who built a movement that had allies with Labour, with Sir Randall Fox, that had allies with different political parties. Okay, and yes, there was discord, there was disagreement. Some of the women were from the United Bahamian Party, some were from the Progressive Liberal Party, but they had a mission and a vision, and they went for it. And there was strife. There was, women who felt that Doris Johnson shouldn't be leading the troop. She was a Johnny-come-lately who came home with a doctorate in a PhD, and where she thinks she going, but they knew she had plenty to give, and they collaborated. So to answer your question, in short, we have a movement right here before us that we need to recognize and build on in a way that that we must be proud of.
Yeah. And I know a lot of, I know at least like the documentary exists, and I thank you for like the work you have been doing, and continue to do toward, some of these goals, because I know it ain't easy, but thank you so much for that.
Yeah, well, yes. And so I'm just saying, yes. I mean, I wasn't, it's funny because when I talked about the women's suffrage movement, some students from CUB who were interviewing me one day said to me, so what was it like voting for the first time in 1962? Well, I was just a little person then. They thought that I was actually a part of the women's suffrage movement, right? It was just really just very funny for me. And so obviously I wasn't there, but I know the history. My parents, my grandparents, my mothers, my aunts, yeah, they were all part of it. So so we have a history and a legacy to build on.
Yeah.
And then, Alicia, you also made mention of the regional movement, of which I was a part, the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action. That was another movement, regional, that really had a great impact, both in the Bahamas and Caribbean-wide. And I think a regional movement is something that we also need to turn our minds to. And Alicia, you're part of the regional women's network and groups.
Yeah,
So,
I think Kafra and Dawn, I think
yes,
we definitely need to engage members from these groups to talk about what it was like to build, period, and to maintain these connections and to work together across all over the region, and to learn from people in other regions, which I know was happening, and this was happening pre-internet, so a lot of it kind of boggles the mind. How is the movement stronger then than it is now?
Right. And the women's suffrage movement, I mean, these women went to in Nagua and all over the Bahamas getting people to sign a petition. I mean, and long before the kind of mobility and that we have now. So we have so much more going for us that we can use, all the new technologies, and it's an exciting time. And I know we can do it. I just think we need to really think about how we want to move forward.
Definitely. So we have some comments. Someone is saying they don't solely subscribe to being a feminist, but as a woman, they think we get more done if we unify our efforts. And this is a timely topic, and it's important that we continue to work to create greater awareness. And the goal is to educate our men as well. Many of our people are stuck and comfortable.
Mhm.
And then we have a question about feminist movements in the region that have taken off, which we talked about a little bit already. They're all in the past. Right now, there are definitely efforts to build and to form connections. And from my observation and my own participation, to me, it's happening in other thematic areas. It's happening in the climate space for sure.
Sure.
Really great. Not quite the same for women's rights. So your mileage may vary, basically. There's still quite a lot to do. And then someone says, I find that the frank acknowledgement of internalized misogyny amongst women and understanding the different ways how it manifests is a huge step in establishing stronger bonds among communities. Based on my personal experience, having direct examples and being able to critically examine myself so that I could deconstruct the destructive, misogynistic, homophobic, and transphobic habits and thoughts I had growing up allows me to become a safer person where people are more receptive to my actions and words concerning discrimination in our society.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things, I mean, just based on that particular comment there, one of the things that I found really useful in the movements that I was involved in were really the retreats that we gave ourselves, retreats where we could really do the kind of work, the personal work that needs to be done, because let's make no mistake about it, if we don't do that personal work, it will impact everything else. So the personal work that, I'm not sure who the speaker was that you were just reading, the person who made those comments about looking at their own, looking at themselves and understanding and moving forward and addressing their own internalized homophobia, transphobia, etc. So I guess what I'm saying is that we found that retreats were really great ways to have these kinds of conversations where we exchange with each other, shared. We also did the work. We also did work too. So it was a combination of retreat and work that addressed those very personal things that we all are engaged with, and how that better informs the work that we do moving forward. So, and in those days, Alicia, what happened was we also had funding was a different issue then. And in the 80s and 90s, governments like the Netherlands and other governments actually funded, progressive women's rights movements like CAFRA. So, but those sources don't seem to be as readily available in this environment, but I'm sure they're still
Not quite the same. And it's important to note that in the Bahamas, we have a particular challenge because of our GDP and being classed as a high income country. It means that we get disqualified from a lot of funding that's available, even when that funding is specific to the Caribbean. We are not on the list because of the income, and we can talk a lot about GDP and how ridiculous it is and how insufficient it is as a tool for measuring and how unrelated it is to funding that is available for this kind of work from the private sector. Because the assumption, right, is that if your GDP is high, then surely the government and the private sector are funding what you have going on, which is just not the truth. In addition to the GDP being a very poor measurement tool for a country that's entirely reliant on a tourism industry that it doesn't own, but we're not going to get into that rant, I don't think, right now. Khadijah's saying the Combahee River Collective said the same thing about retreats and how important they were to building movements. Someone's asking, are there specific examples of discrimination against women in the context of healthcare, other than the availability of reproductive health services, whether in the Bahamas or prominent in other regions?
Alicia, you can respond to that. You've done, I think Quality Bahamas has looked at some of the health services here that are.
I'm thinking a lot of it is related to reproductive health services. I'm trying to think of something that isn't about reproductive services.
That's the main thing that I'm thinking of.
Mhm. I guess I could complicate the idea of discrimination a little bit, and we can talk about women being disproportionately affected by breast cancer, and that in the Bahamas we have the highest rate of BRCA gene mutations in the world, which increases the risk of breast cancer. And in the Bahamas, women are getting diagnosed earlier, about 20 years earlier than the global average, and with later stages. So generally getting diagnosed in stage 3 and 4. And you can't get a mammogram on a family island. You have to be able to find the money to travel to New Providence, and you need to have accommodations, especially if you are coming from an island that doesn't have daily flights. And there isn't public support for this. So you might see that the Cancer Society of the Bahamas talks about its program, which brings women who are over the age of 30 who've never had a mammogram before to New Providence and supports them in getting the mammogram done and having accommodations and getting them back home as well. So this is an area that needs a lot of attention, and we don't often think about discrimination in this way, but it is something that needs to be addressed when we're looking at this, looking at it just generally, but especially when we look at the BRCA gene mutation, the prevalence in the Bahamas, and what that means with regard to being diagnosed with breast cancer as well as ovarian cancer.
Right. Yes. Thank you for that, Alicia. And I'm looking at the concluding observations from the CEDAW committee, which highlights several different things, and breast cancer is one of them. Another area, and mostly it is reproductive health, because that is the area that where we have the discrimination against women and girls, because that's the service that the reproductive health is a service that we use as part of our daily living. One of them is this whole issue of the age of, the age of consent is 16, and the question arises as to the agency of a 16, 17 year old in terms of access to contraceptives and safe abortion, information around their reproductive health and their needs. So this came up during the CEDAW committee, where there's an inconsistency between the age of consent and deliberate access to reproductive health services for a 16, 17-year-old person. So what we were asking the Bahamas government to do is to make it consistent that a 16-year-old, 17-year-old can have access to reproductive health services without parental authorization. So that's another one, but it's largely to do with reproductive health. There's another one here concerning the prevalence of newly diagnosed cases of HIV/AIDS among women. This was another issue that was brought up at the CEDAW committee when the Bahamas came there. And that's also related to reproductive health, but it's also not related to reproductive health. But there was that issue of discrimination within the health services concerning women with HIV. Decriminalizing abortion, definitely. The other issue here was about the school curriculum and instituting a comprehensive sexual and reproductive health curriculum for at an age appropriate level for primary and high school students as part of the right to health, the general right to health. So those are some of the issues. And then there was the issue of mental health services that came up for women under the right to health. So I would recommend that those of us who are on this Zoom look at the concluding observations. I'm not, Alicia, you can probably just put a link there. Because this document is the recommendations the CEDAW committee would make to a country, the Bahamas and specifically, about the issues that affect women and girls in the Bahamas. And you can see that we cover the right to health, employment, gender-based violence, the Constitution, family matters, corporal punishment, nationality issues, the fact that women cannot give their citizenship to their children if they're married to a non-Bahamian and they're born outside of the Bahamas. These are all part of the document that you could refer to and see what the issues are that came up during the dialogue between the Bahamas and the CEDAW committee, and how we responded to those issues. And there's a big part of it is health.
There's also, if you wanted to know a bit more about the convention itself and dive into the specific articles, like if you're really interested in health and you want to focus on that, you can go to the Equality Bahamas YouTube channel to find the recordings of the series of sessions we did with experts from the CEDAW committee last year. So we had an expert join us to go through article by article, and those sessions were maybe about 90 minutes. And it's a good way to get a better understanding of the article, the subject matter, and how it's applicable in the Bahamas, and in some cases, how it was applied elsewhere in the world, just to get a better sense of how the convention is applied and the way that the committee handles reviews. And so you can get to that playlist from just going to our YouTube channel, or you can go to tiny.cc/CEDAW series, and that will take you directly to the playlist. That's tiny.cc/CEDAW series. Do we have other questions? I know somebody, I'm not going to say your name, but you had your hand up. Did you still want to unmute? No, maybe we answered the question already. Okay, Khadijah.
So I had another question, kind of based on something you said earlier about, how the women, back in the day, like they were able to use, these instruments to like leverage their right to vote and stuff like that. And I'm wondering, like, I have it's sort of like a two-part question. Like, the first question is, do you still feel, and I guess I should preface the question by saying, like, it's really hard for me right now as someone, like, I'm trying to do my PhD, I'm finishing up writing, and it's in public policy. So one of the pieces of legislation I work really closely with is the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities, right? And right now, looking at the Caribbean, and how are we holding these governments accountable to ratifying, again, like these pieces of legislation that they sign on to contractually, right? How do we have faith in these instruments when we feel like there is no recourse, like no real legal recourse, right? Because you have to have like a lot of resources to be able to go to court, right? Like litigation ain't cheap, and the average person don't have the time, energy, resources, whatever, to do it. How do we have faith in these as like activists, as citizens, people that want to fight for change, when it feels sometimes like there's no real teeth in these things other than just, like saying we have signed on to these, like, and that the government is responsible, right? And then the second part of that question is, do you still feel like in 2024, like these instruments are as respected as they maybe once were back in, like, especially to the Bahamas, right? Like as a country that was probably, it didn't have its independence, now has its independence. And so, we kind of like popping our shit a little bit. So yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so yes, there is a general feeling, and if we look at the issue of the Palestinian issue, and it's gone to the ICJ, and all the the worldwide protests in support of Palestine, and the violations of the international law by Israel, etc. We wonder, even before then, we wonder what is the utility and usefulness of these instruments. It's all yeah, the questions are rampant, and they're right. They're questions that should be asked. I think I want to remain hopeful, for one, and it's not just sort of a fancy way of thinking about it, but I do, sitting on the CEDAW committee, because I've got the experience, I can see how the CEDAW Convention has progressed the rights of women in various countries. I mean, I can see that on the ground. So I know factually and in real time that it's made a difference. And so I really anchor my hope and faith in what I know to be the reality. So just one example that comes to my mind immediately is that Mali came before us. It didn't have a legislation on female genital mutilation. They had a draft bill that had been in place for years and years. And in coming before us, within a 2-year period, they enacted the legislation criminalizing FGM, based on the conversations that we had. We also showed them other countries, Muslim Arabic countries, non-Muslim Arabic countries that had criminalized FGM. So there are ways in which these international instruments do have an impact. And a lot of it too depends on the NGO activism within the countries too, that the synergy between the government or not and the NGOs and that can make things happen. So I will not throw out these international instruments, but I do feel and think and know that, damn it, the whole UN needs to be transformed and reconstructed. So that's part of it. And then these conventions fall within their own ambit. So yes, let's do that. Now a piece that I had brought up earlier, which I didn't mention, is that the Bahamas also reserved, Alicia, on Article 29 of the convention. And Article 29 of the convention is the article that would allow the Bahamas to be taken by another country before the ICJ. The Bahamas reserved on that. So yes, I mean, there are ways in which countries like the Bahamas really do feel that our profile in the International Committee is enhanced by ratifying these conventions. But, as you're saying, Khadisha, what does it mean domestically? Is it just for public profiling, etc.? And unfortunately, I think sometimes that is the case. And so it is for us as rights holders, persons with disabilities under the DPR, the Convention for Persons with Disabilities, we're the ones that have to hold the governments and make them accountable. So it's not that they ratify the convention and that's the end of it. It's that the rights holders have got to be informed and know how to use these instruments. And I think they do have some leveraging power. I mean, that is what we're trying to talk about here. And so the enforcement of it, yes, there is no criminal penalty if you violate the CEDAW Convention. The CEDAW Committee doesn't have any authority or power to make a country enact the offense of marital rape. But the conversation between us and the Bahamas must have some meaning, and it then is taken up by the NGOs to really create the kind of fire to make it happen. So there are lots of pieces that go together with these conventions. And the other thing is that I think the Bahamas needs to remove this Article 29 so that it can stand as a country before the ICJ if and when, you know, that time comes. You know,
Someone was asking about the Inter-American Court of Human Rights as well, but the Bahamas doesn't acknowledge
No.
any of these courts, and it
Yeah.
also does not ratify optional protocols. So, Marion, can you talk a little bit about optional protocols, what that means?
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. So just back to the court system, then I think we really need to do some work on getting the government to ratify the Inter-American Court and so that we can be a part of that jurisdiction also, and also the ICJ. So the optional protocol is a complementary convention of the CEDAW Committee, which allows individual women in the country that has ratified the optional protocol to bring individual complaints to the CEDAW Committee. So under the convention itself, the CEDAW Committee sits with governments, and we talk, and we look at their state party reports, and we challenge them on this, and we affirm them for making some advances, and then we come out with our recommendations. That's the convention. Apart from the convention, or in addition to the convention, there's something called the optional protocol, which is another convention that's collateral to the CEDAW Convention. It has all the same rights in it that the CEDAW Convention has. But what it does is it expands the access to justice for women in the countries that have ratified it. The Bahamas has not ratified the optional protocol, but under the optional protocol, an individual woman can allege that her government has violated her human right. And she can then make a complaint to the CEDAW Committee. And that is when we sit as a quasi-judicial body to adjudicate the complaint that has been made before us. Before the complaint comes before us, the individual should have exhausted the domestic remedies within their country. So they should have gone to, let's say, the Supreme Court or some other tribunal that could deal with that particular complaint and exhausted the domestic remedies. Then they come to the CEDAW Committee. Now, I have sat on the quasi-judicial body for 4 years on the CEDAW Committee, and it is an effective body. I can tell you that the findings that we make under the optional protocol, countries by and large adhere to those findings. So those findings can be monetary reparation, they can be psychosocial rehabilitation that the government has to pay for, let's say, a gender-based violence violation. So I find that the optional protocol does have some teeth to it. And I would really want to see for us to find a way for the Bahamas to ratify the optional protocol. Most of our complaints come under the gender-based violence violation of women's human rights. And so it's a way that individual women can further access justice for individual violations of their human rights. And one more thing, under the optional protocol, there's also another process that we adjudicate as the CEDAW Committee. We have the right to do a site visit to any country that has shown systematic violations of women's rights. So, for example, we've gone to South Africa where there's been huge systemic violations of gender-based violence and domestic violence, and we've done an investigation, and we've made a report to South Africa. They then have to look at our report and comply with the recommendations that we've made to them, having done the site visit to South Africa. And there have been several of these kinds of, they're called inquiries that we have done. And these are also very effective ways of accessing justice for women, groups of women whose rights have been violated. So I would really want us to look at this issue Equality Bahamas and see how we can get the Bahamas to ratify the optional protocol.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting point to make around, the Bahamas just choosing not to participate in any kind of court or any kind of individual complaints being taken to another body, to a body with experts. And the fact that the optional protocols are optional, and tie this to a question that I wanted to ask you earlier about the impression that so many people have that the United Nations is some foreign agenda, and that ratifying conventions and joining declarations is a threat to sovereignty.
Yeah, that's a question that comes up a lot. And it's interesting because I'm hearing it less now than I did, let's say, during the 2 referenda when we were trying to get the Constitution to be changed. But yes, I mean, it's the Bahamas, again, it's about knowing our history. The Bahamas has had a long history of engagement with the United Nations, even before independence. The Bahamas, in regard to the majority rule movement of the 60s, went before the United Nations to make a complaint about the lack of democracy and the boundaries that were construed towards the United Bahamian Party. And yeah, so the Bahamas has had a history of going before the United Nations. So when Bahamians say, where are we going? Why are we dealing with the United Nations? What role do they play in our life? Well, we have used the United Nations for our benefit in the 50s, 60s, hugely. The women of the women's suffrage movement also used it. The labor movement, Sarando Fox was integrally related to the ILO, which is a unit within the United Nations. So the Bahamas pre-independence has had a history of engagement with the United Nations. So post-independence, when we voluntarily joined the United Nations, I just use it's voluntary. I mean, we did it because we wanted to be a part of this international committee of states, and rightly so. I mean, yeah, I mean, there are benefits to being a part of the United Nations. So in terms of the sovereignty, I mean, yes, I mean, there is no absolute sovereignty anywhere, so most countries have some kind of restrictions on their sovereignty when you're part of any international convention. Let's take our financial services sector of the Bahamas. We hop, skip, and jump when the OECD tells us to do X, Y, Z. We don't complain about sovereignty then, really. I mean, we just do it, so this issue of sovereignty is useful when it's useful to certain sectors, and when it's not, then we complain about it. But yes, your sovereignty within an international community does have some restrictions placed on it, but you can flout those restrictions if you want to, and if you can get away with it, that's fine. We can see it happening everywhere. Right in front of us. So sovereignty is yeah, it is what it is. And yes, the Bahamas, like Cuba came before us just this past October, and I asked them about ratifying the optional protocol, and they said to me, no, we're not ratifying the optional protocol because we're a sovereign nation and we don't need to be adjudicated by anybody else other than our own domestic courts. So then why are you part of the convention, period? So it's just you used your sovereignty to ratify the convention, yet you're now saying you're sovereign and you don't want to ratify the optional protocol. It's just, yeah, you use it when you want to use it for your benefit or not. So I don't think it's really a relevant question.
Yeah.
that states parties put forward.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Dylan.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting, as I didn't get to catch the CEDAW series, unfortunately. My question is, to what extent do we tackle like the legislation angle of this fight for women's rights versus the public consciousness, given that the Bahamas as a like probably as a direct result of a history tied to like colonial exploitation remains, to put it lightly, overwhelmingly conservative or even regressive to a fault in like all walks of life in like the Bahamian lifestyle, I guess. Uh, whether it's in constitution or in the private places. People seem to have been like convinced that a violent status quo is somehow acceptable. So like like where are the most effective efforts right now? Is it in legislation or in wherever people are being socialized, I guess, like the general public?
Right, right. I think, Alicia, I'd really like to hear from you on that, given that Equality Bahamas is works with both legislation and in the public sphere with public education, awareness raising. Yeah, I mean, you do that on the ground. What's your response to Dylan's question?
We've definitely had a lot of emphasis on advocacy for legal reform for a long time. And the referendum period, that 2014 to 2016, made it really clear that advocacy isn't enough. And that we, the advocates, there aren't enough of us. And to really be effective and get the changes that we need more people. And so we
Right.
shifted a lot of our focus to building people power and ensuring that others have access to information, are exposed to other ways of thinking, and kind of bringing people along with us on this journey of learning more about the issues, learning more about human rights and the mechanisms that are available to us, so that when we are advocating, we have a base that is supportive. It's not effective, I don't think, to do one without the other. We need people to want the change, because we know that political will is built on the ground. Governments aren't doing anything that they think is unpopular unless it's of service to them, right? Unless it's something financial or it's to corruption that can kind of grease palms. But in terms of rights, they are looking to the people, and they are looking to people of influence who they believe can sway votes. So that is why we're seeing so much power being built by anti-rights fundamentalist groups, and that's what we have to at least match to be able to make any kind of progress. So the two have to happen at the same time.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And where we sit on the CEDAW committee, I mean, we see that legislation and legislative reforms can happen and can take place, but implementation is another story, and also public awareness, public education is really key to the legislation being effective in any way. So I think they have to go hand in hand. And there may be times when the focus is on one because of the environment or other circumstances, but I think both legislative reform and advocacy have to really be in tandem. And if I think of the women's suffrage movement, I mean, working towards the right to vote, their platform of public education was big. I mean, they knew that the public had to understand the issues of what the right to vote meant, what suffrage meant, and what the lack of it would mean. And so they had public education sessions all the time, for the public. So it's an important part, I think.
We had a few people saying, when we were talking about the suffrage movement earlier, that they would like to have a session dedicated to that, to learning more about the movement. And we have screened the documentary a number of times, and I don't think any number of times is enough. So we'll look at planning one for 2025, maybe ahead of International Women's Day for the March and Expo, so that we have that historical grounding and we have that energy in us for the march and for the
Right.
demands that we're taking to the street at that time.
Mhm. Perfect.
Is the documentary available online?
Yes.
And it's called Womanish Ways, everyone.
Yes, we can screen it on Zoom. That wouldn't be a problem.
But it's not, you can't find it online and watch it at home by yourself.
Oh, I see. Not at this point. I mean,
Okay.
they're the old technology DVDs are available, but I mean, nobody uses DVDs anymore. Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, so we'll arrange a screening in 2025 for sure. Maybe we'll do one in person and a virtual one for folks who are not in New Providence so that everybody has access. Because it's really important. It's an important documentary. And I think this conversation has really made it clear. I mean, we were here to talk about CEDAW, but there's so much to say about the importance of history and knowing who came before. And sometimes you can feel like you just made everything up and you're doing the work by yourself, or you're thinking about things by yourself, but really we're building on work that was done. And there's so much that we can learn from the tactics that were used then, even if we can't copy them because we're living in a completely different society. I mean, going door to door, the way that the suffragists did.
Oh, it's not.
People live behind walls and gates and
Dogs.
dogs and all these things. But we have to think about what that might look like. Maybe it's lunch and learns, right? Meeting people at their workplace and making these kinds of arrangements. But we have to think
Town center.
about how we can adapt some of those methods that were actually quite successful. We have somebody saying, we as a country have had no issues, what is that, in the past, giving up some sort of sovereignty over our resources for foreign direct investments. So why should we be worried about signing on to any sort of ratification?
There you go.
Very good question. Very
Yes.
good question.
Yeah.
And
All these connections and interlinkages are so important, Yeah.
definitely.
Yes.
Ternille, I see your
Dylan-
hand.
Dylan was talking about our colonial legacy, and that's really significant because several of these laws that we're trying to change are colonial relics, like the marital rape law is from the 17th century, so these are things that we really need to pay attention to in terms of our colonial legacy and disrupting that and dismantling it in every way, including legislation.
And this is tied to the conversation that is happening that everyone might not be a part of, but the conversation that is happening about reparations. And if you haven't been paying attention, be sure to look up and follow the Bahamas Reparations Committee and look at the work that's being done by the Caribbean Reparations Committee. Look up the 10-point plan. If you just Google CARICOM 10-point plan reparations, it'll come right up.
Yes.
And there is, I wouldn't say a trend, but there are colonial powers that are acknowledging the role that they have played in creating inequality
Mhm.
and discrimination and violence against women, girls, and LGBTQI plus people. And we can talk more about that, but we're seeing it. We're seeing the UK and European countries being attentive to that. And that's probably one of the reasons that the Netherlands has been such a big funder
Yes.
of women's rights and LGBTQI plus people's rights.
In the past. Mhm.
Ternille, do you want to unmute?
Good evening, everyone.
All right. Yeah.
I noticed quite a few people have asked, what can we do as individuals? And this is a great presentation. Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Alicia. And if we really understand our networks, especially in this digital age of social media, we have a lot of power. So if you have 100 followers on Facebook, you might want to take a moment and just invite those who you think would be interested in following Equality Bahamas. There's a feature on Equality Bahamas page that says invite friends. If you're a WhatsApp person and you have broadcast groups, you might want to share the link to recordings about the CEDAW sessions. Whatever you decide to do, is going to be a lot more powerful than it would have been back in the women's suffrage movement day. Just for the fact that we can sit at our own homes now and have 10 of us on this live and maybe 30 on Facebook and throughout other social media is a testament to the power that we now have as individuals to disseminate information that we'd never ever had in history before. So even using hashtags, signing petitions, sharing your own posts. Like when you hop off of this call, if we decide on a hashtag that's being used for 16 days of activism, and you might just say something like, hey, the Bahamas needs to call for whatever, whatever. And if someone else uses the same hashtag, that populates a page of links where people posted using the same hashtag. So I think Alicia was talking about not having the man or woman or human power to be all advocates. We actually can, but in a different sort of way that isn't so like you don't have to write a column, you don't have to lead an organization, you don't have to volunteer. You could literally use a hashtag, make a post, invite people to your favorite organization's pages. We have so much power if we just take some time to think strategically how we could utilize it through social media and technology.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks for that, Janelle. You reminded me that when that question came up the first time, I was thinking about what we can do within our own circles, because I think a lot of times we forget about the people closest to us. Are you having conversations with your family members and with your friends about rights, about their practices, about their behavior, about the things that they say, things that we're probably used to hearing and sometimes let it slide as a joke, but has a real meaning and can have a real effect on people who do or do not recognize those as jokes, who do or do not recognize those as systemic issues. Sometimes the most important work that we can do is within our own homes, within our own social circles to change people's minds and start to change people's behavior and eventually win people over and get them to join us in making noise and raising hell.
Yep.
And we have another comment. Oh, yes. One of the short tales performed at the Dundas in September featured the Bahamian women's suffrage movement, spoken from the perspective of the suffragettes and gave details of their lives. Aside from this in the documentary, do you know of any other media available that ensures that the history is recounted from the women's point of view?
Mhm.
Do you know of any other pieces around the suffrage movement, Marion, that are
Articles, yes. I don't know. I know several articles. But other social media kinds of representations, no.
okay? I know there are lots of documents and pamphlets and things like that. I'm not sure how accessible they are online, but they're very helpful, very instructive, I think, for the work ahead as well. And a lot of it's quite profound. The connections being made, like you said, the use of the United Nations international mechanisms for human rights, quoting them and contextualizing them to the Bahamas and to that specific struggle,
Yes.
the right to vote, a very, very sophisticated advocacy and advocacy tools.
Mhm, mhm. Mm. So I'm trying to get UB, University of the Bahamas Library, to enhance the website that we began on the women's suffrage movement, which is really not very substantial at this point, but I think 2025 we're going to work on it and upload the historic documents and on the suffrage movement.
Yeah, someone's asking about the articles being available on Google Scholar. I think they're just on the website that the University of the Bahamas runs.
Mhm.
I'll try to find the link and post it on the Equality Bahamas Facebook page so that you can
Some of that.
access it there. We are in our last 4 minutes, so I'll take this time to remind you that this is the Global 16 Days campaign, also known as 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. There are events happening all over the world that are focused on ending gender-based violence. We at Equality Bahamas always have a series of events. We're about halfway through now. The next event is tomorrow. We hope you will join us Tuesday, December 3rd at 6 for Channeling Our Rage. Really looking forward to it. We will be joined by Paula Hamilton Smith, who is an actor and theater teacher, the author of 2 theater textbooks, who is from and based in Trinidad, to bring us a theater workshop to get us practicing sitting in and expressing our rage. It should be fun. It might be kind of intense, but I think it's going to be fun. Paula is pretty cool, pretty high energy. And on Wednesday, we will be joined by the Master of Disasters, Baris Griffin, to talk about disasters, what they look like, what preparedness looks like, what disaster risk management really means, and how we are or should be handling or addressing or acknowledging and responding to the different ways that disasters affect women, girls, LGBTQI plus people, people with disabilities, unhoused people, and others who are experiencing various forms of marginalization and oppression. Then on Thursday, very importantly, we will be joined by Taitu Heron, who has done research on femicide in Barbados, the Bahamas, and Jamaica. So she will be doing a pretty brief presentation on her findings in that research. And this is a very important topic for us because we have been calling for the past few years now for the sex and gender-based killing of women and girls to be specifically classified, named, and counted as femicide, not lumped in with all murder or all homicide, because we need to be able to separate these cases out, analyze them, identify risk factors and indicators. And this is the only way that we're really going to be able to prevent these cases and to be able to adequately and effectively intervene in cases of gender-based violence. This is a very big demand that we have, and you'll be seeing that on the socials very shortly, all of our 4 demands. So for more information on all of these events, you can go to tiny.cc/16days24 to register for them. I've just named all of the remaining virtual events. And then from the weekend, from Saturday, we will be in person hanging out at Poinciana Paper Press to get creative. Really, really looking forward to a day of printmaking on Saturday. You can drop in anytime from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. to carve your own stamp, to do some block printing, and to screen print your very own bandana. And then we'll be joined on Monday by Stacey Ann Chin from Jamaica for a writing workshop. And we will close out on Tuesday, which is Human Rights Day, with a rage bookmaking session with Sonia Farmer at Poinciana Paper Press. So again, tiny.cc/16days24 for all of this information and for registration. Please, if you haven't already, join our mailing list, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to stay up to date. Marion Bethel, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your expertise, for walking us through these key parts of the convention and talking about the importance of it and how we can really harness it, how we can leverage it to build better systems. We know that the onus isn't on us as women and girls to just withstand, right? To endure. And we need to get rid of this thinking, this idea that that is our role, and that is, this character trait that's so positive when it's the government's responsibility to ensure that we are living in an environment that is safe and that we have full access to our human rights, and it's a peaceful society, and we have equality. So always grateful for your time and all of your insights. That gives us so much to think about and helps us to move forward.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. It's been, I've loved this session. It's been really good for me, and hoping it's been helpful and rewarding for everybody else. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Big thanks to you, Marion. Thanks to the Equality Bahamas team, everyone who shows up and shows out and makes sure that these events happen. And thank you everyone for joining us. See you again tomorrow.